He never caught a single spy. Not one. In 4 years of investigations, hearings, accusations, and public theater, not one communist agent was ever actually unmasked by Joseph McCarthy. 0. And yet thousands of Americans lost their careers, their reputations, and in some cases their lives because of what he said. Schoolteachers were fired, screenwriters were blacklisted, diplomats who'd served their country for decades were hauled before cameras and destroyed on national television. Because one man with a piece of paper and an unshakable confidence in his own story pointed at them. Here's what makes this genuinely strange. This wasn't medieval Europe. This wasn't some distant empire ruled by kings and inquisitors. This was America in the early 1950s. The most powerful democracy on Earth, the country that had just defeated Nazi Germany, the country whose founding document opens with a commitment to liberty and justice.
And for 4 straight years, that country couldn't stop one senator from Wisconsin. We're going to tell you exactly how he did it. How fear becomes a weapon, how a bluff becomes a movement, and how one courtroom, one attorney, one moment of live television finally cracked the whole thing open. If this already got you thinking, hit subscribe. New videos drop every day. And seriously, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from right now? To understand McCarthyism, you have to go back to the years just before it began. Because here's the thing about the Red Scare. McCarthy didn't invent the fear. He found it already burning, picked it up, and held it to the world's face. Picture America in the summer of 1945. The war is over. The celebrations are deafening. Troops are coming home. The United States has emerged from the deadliest conflict in human history as the undisputed leader of the Western world. American industry is booming. American science has split the atom. American soldiers liberated concentration camps and crossed the Rhine and raised flags on islands in the Pacific. For one bright, exhausted moment, the future looks open. And then, almost immediately, the walls start closing in. By 1949, 4 years after that victory, the world had turned upside down. The Soviet Union, America's wartime ally, the country whose soldiers had fought alongside Americans against Hitler, detonated its own atomic bomb. Just like that, the American monopoly on the most terrifying weapon ever built was gone. And that wasn't even the worst news of that year. In China, Mao Zedong and his communist forces swept across the country and took power, pushing out the American-backed government. A country with more people than any other on Earth had just gone red. And then, a year later, North Korean forces crossed the border into South Korea, and American boys were dying again. This time, fighting communist soldiers. It's hard to overstate what this felt like from inside America. In just a few years, the world had gone from American triumph to something that felt, to a lot of people, like the beginning of a losing battle. And into that anxiety walked a question that seemed almost inevitable. How did this happen? Who let it happen? And the answer that certain voices started whispering, and then shouting, was that it must have been someone on the inside. A traitor. An enemy who had been hiding in plain sight. That suspicion had actual fuel, because the spies were real. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, a couple from New York, were arrested in 1950 for passing nuclear secrets to the Soviets. They would be convicted and executed in the summer of 1953, the only American civilians put to death for espionage during the entire Cold War. A State Department official named Alger Hiss was convicted of perjury in connection with accusations that he'd passed classified documents to Soviet agents. The spy networks existed. The infiltration to some degree was real.
But here's where the story gets complicated. Because what was real, a genuine Soviet intelligence operation that was actually limited in scope, actually being dismantled by the time McCarthy arrived, became, in the hands of the right demagogue, something infinitely larger and more monstrous. The Rosenbergs were two people. McCarthy would claim there were hundreds of traitors, thousands of sympathizers, an entire hidden army embedded in every institution in American life. The real spies were the spark. McCarthy was the wildfire. But to become that wildfire, he first had to become someone worth listening to. Joseph Raymond McCarthy was born on a farm in Grand Chute, Wisconsin, in the fall of 1908. He was the fifth of 9 children, the kid who grew up shy and a little awkward, the one the other kids didn't entirely know what to make of. His parents were devout Irish Catholics, hard-working, not wealthy. The family scratched a living out of the land. At 14, McCarthy dropped out of school and went into chicken farming. This is not a metaphor. He literally raised chickens. He was actually briefly successful at it. But the ambition that burned in him from childhood couldn't stay in a henhouse. At 20, he enrolled in high school, completed 4 years of coursework in a single year, graduated, and enrolled at Marquette University in Milwaukee. He was elected president of his law school class. He earned his law degree in 1935. Whatever else you want to say about Joseph McCarthy, the man had drive that most people can't touch. He became a lawyer. Then he ran for circuit judge in Wisconsin's 10th Judicial Circuit, at 30 years old, the youngest circuit judge the state had ever elected. Then, when World War II started, he enlisted in the Marine Corps. And here is where the story of Joe McCarthy and the story of Joe McCarthy's mythology begin to diverge.
Because in the Marines, he was a ground intelligence officer, a desk job. He did fly as a rear-seat gunner on some reconnaissance missions, which gave him the nickname Tail Gunner Joe. But the dramatic war record he would later build his political identity on, the injuries, the combat heroism, the 10,000 rounds of ammunition fired in defense of America, was fabricated. He invented much of it himself. None of that stopped him from running for Senate in 1946 on the strength of that invented record. He was up against a legend, Robert La Follette Jr., whose family had represented Wisconsin in the Senate for decades, a man so embedded in the state's political fabric that defeating him seemed almost absurd. McCarthy's campaign was aggressive, personal, and utterly relentless. He accused La Follette of war profiteering. He hammered him on every front. And somehow, shockingly, McCarthy won the Republican primary. He won the general election. At 38, Joe McCarthy became a United States Senator. And then he spent 4 years doing essentially nothing. His first term in the Senate was so undistinguished that colleagues barely knew his name. He missed votes. He got tangled in minor scandals. He pushed a housing bill that went nowhere. A Washington journalist at the time described him as the worst senator in Washington, and nobody argued the point. By early 1950, McCarthy was running out of road. He was up for re-election in 2 years. He had almost no record to run on. He was unpopular at home, unimportant in Washington, and running out of time. He needed something. He needed an issue. And over dinner in January of 1950, a Catholic priest named Edmund Walsh, a Georgetown professor who had studied Soviet Russia and its atheist ideology, suggested one to him: the communist infiltration of the American government. McCarthy reportedly slapped the table and said, "That's it. That's the issue." He just needed the stage. On the night of February 9th, 1950, a group of Republican women gathered at the McClure Hotel in Wheeling, West Virginia. It was Lincoln Day, the annual celebration of the Great Emancipator, a traditional moment for Republican speechifying. McCarthy was booked to speak. He had 2 speeches with him,
one about housing policy, one about the communist threat. A friend at the airport had suggested he go with the communism angle, so he did. McCarthy stood up in front of those Republican women and delivered a speech that was, by all accounts, rambling and improvised. Secretary of State Dean Acheson would later describe it as the slovenly, lazy, undisciplined work of a man who could barely organize his thoughts. But near the end of the speech, McCarthy reached into his jacket or his briefcase, the exact detail is disputed, and pulled out a piece of paper. He waved it at the audience.
"I have here in my hand," he said, "a list of 205 names that were made known to the Secretary of State as being members of the Communist Party, and who, nevertheless, are still working and shaping policy in the State Department." The room barely reacted. A lawyer in the audience later said the speech didn't cause a ripple. The next morning's local newspaper carried the story, but the reporter later admitted he had written it from McCarthy's prepared text, not the actual speech. Nobody even knew for certain what number McCarthy had actually said, because as the days went on, the number kept changing. 205 became 57, then 81, then different numbers entirely, depending on which speech you read. There was no list. Let that land for a second. The piece of paper that launched one of the most destructive political movements in American history. The paper that put the names of hundreds of innocent people in the crosshairs did not contain what McCarthy said it contained. He had held up a blank piece of theater. But something wild happened. The bluff worked. The headlines spread. The wire services picked it up. Senators demanded answers. The State Department scrambled to respond. And McCarthy, who had been a nobody from Wisconsin nobody cared about, suddenly found himself on the front page of every newspaper in the country. Mail flooded his office. Thousands of letters from Americans who were scared, who believed him, who wanted someone to say out loud what they'd been fearing privately. Fan mail, letters of support, invitations to speak. Nobody asked to see the list. Not really. And the few who did challenge McCarthy found out very quickly what happened when you pushed back, because McCarthy didn't argue with critics. He accused them. If you questioned him, you were probably a communist too. If you demanded evidence, you were protecting the guilty. The mechanism was airtight. Every attack on McCarthy became, in McCarthy's telling, proof that the conspiracy was deeper than anyone knew. He had found his issue. And the issue was about to find its legs. Here's what McCarthyism actually looked like from the inside. Not from the Senate chamber or the newspaper front pages, but from the living room, the office, the classroom. Imagine you're a screenwriter in Hollywood. You wrote a couple of leftist scripts in the 1930s during the Depression, when half of American intellectuals were experimenting with socialist ideas. You haven't been a party member in years, maybe ever, but someone gives your name to the House Un-American Activities Committee, the congressional body that had been hunting communist influence in the film industry since the late 1940s. You get a subpoena. You have to appear before the committee. The question they ask you isn't about what you've done recently, or what you believe now. It's, are you now, or have you ever been, a member of the Communist Party? That question is a trap with no exit. If you say yes and name other people who were involved with left-wing organizations, you might get off. But you've just destroyed the careers of your colleagues. If you say no when you once attended 3 party meetings in 1937, you've committed perjury. If you invoke the Fifth Amendment and refuse to answer, that refusal gets reported in every newspaper in the country as evidence of guilt. Refusing to answer a question becomes, in the public mind, the same as admitting you're a communist. The Hollywood 10 found this out the hard way. 10 screenwriters and directors who refused to cooperate with HUAC were charged with contempt of Congress, jailed, and then blacklisted.
Their names went on a list of people no studio would hire. Dalton Trumbo, one of the most successful screenwriters of his era, the man who would eventually win 2 Academy Awards, kept writing because he had to eat. He wrote under fake names, through friends who served as fronts, taking the credit for work that wasn't theirs. He submitted scripts under pseudonyms. He went to Academy Award ceremonies where other people accepted the awards for his movies. This went on for years. Charlie Chaplin, the man who had made America laugh for decades, who had made The Great Dictator specifically to mock Adolf Hitler, was accused of communist sympathies. He left the United States for Europe in 1952 and never returned. His re-entry permit was revoked while he was on board the ship. Orson Welles, Pete Seeger, Lillian Hellman, Langston Hughes, Paul Robeson, one of the greatest artists of the 20th century, had his passport seized, which meant he couldn't work abroad while being blacklisted at home. He was essentially imprisoned inside American borders without ever being charged with a crime. And it wasn't just Hollywood. Teachers were fired from public schools for having attended a communist meeting 15 years earlier. Professors were dismissed from universities. A State Department official could lose his security clearance, and therefore his job, because his sister had once been married to someone whose cousin attended leftist meetings. The logic of guilt by association had no floor. It could reach as far as the accuser needed it to reach. The librarians. This one doesn't get talked about enough. McCarthy and his team actually went after public libraries, places like the overseas libraries run by the US State Department, designed to project American culture abroad. They demanded lists of books by suspected communists or fellow travelers. Books were pulled from shelves. Some were burned. In 1953, Eisenhower himself, who privately despised McCarthy but publicly tolerated him, had to give a commencement speech urging Americans not to join book burners. He didn't say McCarthy's name. Nobody with political ambitions did.
Because here's the other thing about the machine.
It ran on silence. The people who knew it was wrong, who privately thought McCarthy was dangerous and dishonest, most of them said nothing. Republican senators who understood perfectly well that there was no list, that the evidence was fabricated, that the numbers changed every time McCarthy told the story, they went along with it because the midterm elections were coming and the crowds seemed to love him. Eisenhower, who would have been the one man with the stature to stop McCarthy cold, spent years refusing to engage publicly. He told aides he wouldn't get in the gutter with that guy. Fear of being next, fear of the accusation, fear of the list. That fear kept the machine running as much as McCarthy's bluster did. The senator didn't have an army. He had a microphone and a country too frightened to call his bluff. And at his right hand, through all of it, the strategist, the enforcer, the man who gave the machine its teeth, was Roy Cohn. Roy Marcus Cohn was born in the Bronx in February of 1927, the only child of a well-connected judge and a fiercely devoted mother. From the moment he could think, he was surrounded by power. Politicians and lawyers and judges came to the family apartment. His father was a Democratic Party operative, a fixer, a man who understood how the machinery of influence actually worked. Roy absorbed all of it, the way other kids absorb baseball statistics. He was, by any measure, freakishly brilliant. He finished high school early, earned both his undergraduate degree and his law degree from Columbia University before he turned 21. Too young, actually, to even take the bar exam when he graduated. He spent a year waiting until he was old enough to be licensed. Then he walked into the United States Attorney's Office in Manhattan and became a federal prosecutor at an age when most of his classmates were still paying off student loans. He made his name in the Rosenberg trial. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, The couple convicted of passing nuclear secrets to the Soviets were prosecuted and ultimately executed, while Roy Cohn was still in his mid-20s. He played a key role in the case and later boasted, controversially, there were serious questions about the ethics involved, that he had pressured the judge to impose the death penalty. Whether that's entirely true or partly self-aggrandizement in the Cohn tradition, the result was undeniable. The Rosenbergs went to the electric chair, and Roy Cohn became famous. Famous enough that J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, wanted to know him. Famous enough to go clubbing with the powerful. Famous enough that in 1953, Joseph McCarthy came looking for him. McCarthy needed a chief counsel for his Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, the committee he was about to turn into his personal inquisition machine. He wanted someone brilliant, aggressive, and completely without sentimentality. He found all three in Roy Cohn. Cohn was 25 years old when he took the job. And here's the paradox that history finds almost darkly comic. Roy Cohn, the man who would spend years helping Joe McCarthy hunt down perverts and homosexuals in the federal government, because the Red Scare ran alongside what historians now call the Lavender Scare, a simultaneous purge of gay federal employees. Roy Cohn was gay. He would never acknowledge it publicly while he lived. He died of AIDS in 1986, still refusing to say the word out loud. But in 1953, none of that mattered as much as what Roy Cohn was doing at the committee. He was brilliant. He was terrifying. He wielded questions like surgical instruments, and he wielded accusations like clubs. He helped McCarthy select targets, prepare cases, and construct the theater of the hearings. Harvard Law Dean Irvin Griswold watched them work and described McCarthy's role as judge, jury, prosecutor, castigator, and press agent, all in one. Add Cohn, and you had the writer, the director, and the producer too. And then Cohn met G. David Schein. Schein was handsome, rich, 26 years old, the son of a hotel magnate. He became Cohn's unpaid aide on the subcommittee, and the two of them embarked on what is possibly the strangest road trip in the history of American political theater. A 17-day trip to Europe in the spring of 1953, visiting American embassies and libraries abroad to hunt for books written by communists or communist sympathizers. Newspapers covered their jaunt with a combination of mockery and incredulity. They threw their weight around in hotels. They lectured ambassadors. They demanded that certain books be removed from shelves. It was simultaneously sinister and farcical. Two young men in expensive suits flying across Europe on the American taxpayer's dime, looking for subversive paperbacks. But nobody stopped them, because McCarthy was still untouchable, and Cohn was his man. Then, that fall, David Schein was drafted into the United States Army, and Roy Cohn could not let that go. What followed was a pressure campaign, relentless, documented, embarrassing, in which Cohn contacted Army officials again and again, demanding special treatment for his friend. Better assignments, passes to leave the base on weekends, exemptions from ordinary duties. The Army Secretary, Robert Stevens, tried to accommodate some of the requests while pushing back on others. The whole thing was being quietly documented, logged, filed. The Army was keeping records of every call, every demand, every instance of Cohn throwing his weight around on behalf of a private. The Army was building a case, and McCarthy, sensing that the Army was about to embarrass him, decided to go on offense first. He would launch an investigation into communist infiltration of the United States military. He would accuse the Army itself of being soft on communism, of protecting subversives, of failing America. He had spent 4 years accusing. He had toppled professors and screenwriters and diplomats and librarians. He had gone after the State Department, the voice of America, the Democratic Party, the entire intellectual class of mid-century America. Now, he was coming for the United States Army. And this time, the Army hired someone to fight back. Joseph Welch was 63 years old in the spring of 1954. He was a Boston lawyer, a partner at the firm of Hale and Dorr, a mild-mannered man who wore bow ties and had a dry, precise wit that you might easily underestimate. He had white hair and a courtly, almost old-fashioned manner. He looked, frankly, like someone's grandfather. The Army brought him in to represent their interests at what was about to become the most watched television event in American history. The Army-McCarthy hearings ran for 36 consecutive days in the spring and early summer of 1954, broadcast live on television to an audience of millions. Before this, McCarthy had been largely a creature of newspapers and radio, a headline, a voice. Most Americans had read his accusations, but never watched him in sustained, close-up action. They had never seen the way he operated for hours at a stretch, the interruptions, the procedural maneuvers, the sudden lurches into accusation, the way he seemed to feed on the discomfort of witnesses. Now they would watch all of it, in their living rooms, in real time. And something started to shift. But before we get to the hearings, before we get to the moment that broke Joe McCarthy, we need to go back a few weeks. Because before Welch took his seat across the table from McCarthy and Cohn, another man had already thrown the first punch. And he'd done it from a television studio in New York City. Edward R. Murrow had spent the best years of his life reporting from the wreckage of the world. He was the CBS correspondent who had broadcast live from London rooftops during the Nazi bombing raids of the Battle of Britain, his calm, resonant voice carrying the sounds of destruction into American living rooms while the city burned around him. "This is London," he would say, and people 3,000 miles away would hear the air raid sirens in the distance and understand that what was happening was real. Murrow was, by the early 1950s, probably the most trusted voice in American broadcast journalism. His credibility was enormous, his reach was enormous, and he was terrified of what was happening to his country. By early 1954, Murrow and his producer Fred Friendly had been quietly building towards something on their CBS program, See It Now. They had aired episodes that circled the subject without naming it directly. A profile of a military man wrongly denied a security clearance. A report on a community group refused a meeting place because of vague communist associations. They were testing the water, getting closer, waiting for the right moment. That moment came on March 9, 1954. The broadcast that Murrow aired that night was deceptively simple. There were no dramatic narration tricks, no Hollywood music swells. Murrow and Friendly had assembled McCarthy's own words, his speeches, his moments in hearings, his accusations and contradictions, and played them back. They let the tape speak. McCarthy bullying a witness. McCarthy changing his story. McCarthy contradicting himself from one sentence to the next, one hearing to the next, one number to the next. Murrow's commentary between clips was measured, precise, almost quiet. He wasn't screaming. He was pointing. At the end of the program, Murrow delivered a closing statement that has been quoted ever since. "The actions of the junior senator from Wisconsin have caused alarm and dismay amongst our allies abroad and given considerable comfort to our enemies. And whose fault is that? Not really his. He didn't create this situation of fear. He merely exploited it, and rather successfully. Cassius was right. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves. Good night, and good luck." After the broadcast, Murrow and Friendly and their director Don Hewitt, who would later create 60 Minutes, walked across the street to Sardi's restaurant for a late dinner. When the other diners looked up and recognized Murrow, they put down their silverware and began to applaud. The entire restaurant. Murrow later said he knew in that moment that it was going to be okay. Within 2 days, the U.S. Army released a detailed chronology of Roy Cohn's phone calls to Army officials, documenting every request and demand made on behalf of David Schein. The document was damning, and suddenly, the power dynamic had shifted. The accuser was being accused. The man who had pointed at everyone else was being pointed at. McCarthy was given equal time to respond on See It Now. He used it to call Murrow the leader and cleverest of the Jackal Pack, a response so overblown, so obviously defensive, that it only confirmed what Murrow's broadcast had shown. A confident man doesn't bark like that. A guilty man does. The nation had watched. The nation had heard. And in April of 1954, the Army-McCarthy hearings began. The cameras were fixed on a long table in a Senate hearing room. McCarthy sat at one end, thick-necked, intense, his dark 5 o'clock shadow present even in the morning sessions. Roy Cohn sat nearby, young, sleek, always watching. Across the room, on the Army's side of the table, sat Joseph Welch. Day after day, the hearings ground on. McCarthy was in his element, or so he thought. He interrupted, he objected, he pivoted from topic to topic with the speed of someone used to controlling a room through chaos. But something was different now. The cameras caught everything. The camera caught the way he treated witnesses. It caught the sneer, the interruptions, the procedural games he played to derail testimony he didn't like. Americans watching at home were seeing something newspapers could never quite convey. The texture of the man. The way he actually behaved when the pressure was on. And Welch was watching all of it. McCarthy and Welch had an agreement, explicit, on the record, that a young lawyer at Welch's firm named Fred Fisher would not be mentioned during the hearings. Fisher, years earlier as a student at Harvard Law School, had briefly belonged to a legal organization with alleged ties, since thoroughly discredited, to left-wing politics. It was the kind of youthful association that, in a sane political climate, no one would care about. Both sides had agreed to leave it alone. On June 9, 1954, the 35th day of the hearings, McCarthy broke that agreement. He couldn't help himself. Welch had been pressing Cohn on a matter that clearly made Cohn uncomfortable, and McCarthy, watching his young protege squirm, decided to change the subject. He interrupted the proceedings and began talking about Fred Fisher. He named him. He described his supposed communist associations. He talked about what a shame it was that someone like that was working in Welch's law firm. The room went very quiet. Welch set down what he was holding. He looked at McCarthy, and when he spoke, his voice was completely steady. Until this moment, Senator, I think I never really gauged your cruelty or your recklessness. Fred Fisher is a young man who went to the Harvard Law School and came into my firm and is starting what looks to be a brilliant career with us. Little did I dream you could be so reckless and so cruel as to do injury to that lad. McCarthy tried to continue. Cohn, who could see what was coming, looked physically pained. He shook his head almost imperceptibly, as if trying to signal McCarthy to stop. Stop. Stop now. But McCarthy didn't stop, and so Welch said the words. Let us not assassinate this lad further, Senator. You have done enough. Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency? The room erupted in applause. Not from senators, from the audience in the gallery, from the people who had been watching, who had been waiting,
who had been afraid to be the first ones to say it out loud. The applause rolled through the chamber like something that had been held back too long and finally broke free.
McCarthy looked around the room, confused, almost disoriented, as if he genuinely couldn't understand what had just happened. He turned to Cohn and said, in a low voice that the microphones caught, "What did I do?" Cohn reportedly just stared at the table. Joseph Welch had already turned away. With the quiet deliberateness of a man who has said everything that needs to be said, he stood up and walked out of the hearing room without another word. He didn't slam a door. He didn't issue a parting statement. He just left. The chairman, Senator Carl Mundt, kept gaveling for order as the gallery applause continued rolling, and it did not stop quickly. Outside in the corridor, Welch sat down on a bench. A reporter nearby described what happened next. The old lawyer put his face in his hands. His shoulders shook. Joseph Welch, the mild-mannered attorney in the bow tie, the man who had just delivered the most devastating rhetorical blow in the history of the American Senate, Joseph Welch was weeping. Not for himself. He was crying for Fred Fisher, the young man whose early career had just been dragged through the national mud because McCarthy couldn't stop when he should have stopped. For the years. For all the people who had sat in that chair before Fred Fisher and hadn't had a Joseph Welch to speak for them. He had miscalculated. He had finally found the person and the moment where his own playbook stopped working. For 4 years, his power had rested on a single mechanism. He attacked, and the attacked apologized or deflected or disappeared. Nobody had ever simply looked at him, on camera, in front of the whole country, and named what he was doing for what it actually was. Welch did. And once one person said it, everyone who had been thinking it was free to say it too. The hearings wound down, the cameras packed up and went home, and the country went about the business of recalibrating everything it thought it knew about the most feared man in Washington.
Something decisive had already happened, and everyone in Washington could feel it. The way a change in air pressure tells you a storm is coming, or going. The atmosphere around McCarthy had shifted over the preceding weeks. Since Murrow's broadcast, since the Army released its chronology of Cohn's relentless phone calls, since the very first days of the televised hearings when the country finally got its sustained look at how McCarthy actually operated. Welch's question had crystallized all of it into a phrase, simple, direct, and completely unanswerable, that said what 4 years of newspaper coverage had never quite managed to say. Have you no sense of decency? The mail that flooded into the Senate in the days after June 9th ran heavily against McCarthy, a reversal from the years when his office received thousands of supportive letters a week. Gallup polls showed his approval rating in free fall. Republicans who had spent years avoiding any public break with him began, carefully, quietly, to put distance between themselves and the senator from Wisconsin. Nobody held a press conference to announce it. Nobody made a speech denouncing him. The defection happened the way water moves through limestone. Slowly, invisibly, and then all at once. One Republican senator, Ralph Flanders of Vermont, stood up on the Senate floor on July 30th and introduced a motion to censure Joseph McCarthy. Not strip him of his chairmanship, not investigate him, censure him. Formally, officially, in the written record of the United States Senate, for conduct unbecoming of a senator. Flanders was 73 years old, a former machine tool manufacturer, not a dramatic man. But he stood up in front of his colleagues and made the motion. And the motion didn't die. It was referred to a special committee. It was taken seriously. For the first time in 4 years, the machinery that McCarthy had used to flatten everyone around him was being pointed at him.
McCarthy, watching this happen, reacted the only way he knew how. He escalated.
He attacked the committee reviewing his conduct. He called it a lynch party. He called his fellow Republican Senator Arthur Watkins, who chaired the censure committee, cowardly. He called the entire proceeding an act of communist collaboration, naturally, because every act of opposition had always been communist collaboration in McCarthy's universe. Every criticism proved the critic was compromised. Every check on his behavior was evidence of the conspiracy he had always claimed was there. But the frame had cracked. Once you'd seen it crack, once you'd watched Welch's question hang in the air and watched McCarthy fail to answer it, the frame kept cracking. McCarthy's accusations were the same as they'd always been, but now, instead of creating fear, they created something closer to embarrassment. Not for the people he accused, for him. In November of 1954, the midterm elections handed the Democrats control of the Senate, which meant that even if the censure motion failed, McCarthy was about to lose his committee chairmanships. The perches from which he had conducted his investigations and summoned his witnesses and dominated the news cycle. His institutional power was already draining away, regardless of what the censure vote did. On December 2, 1954, the United States Senate voted on the censure of Joseph R. McCarthy. The final tally was 67 to 22 in favor of censure. Every Democratic senator voted yes. More than half the Republican senators did too. The resolution declared that McCarthy had acted contrary to senatorial traditions, a phrase that understates, with magnificent Senate restraint, what he had actually done. Contrary to senatorial traditions. The man had destroyed hundreds of careers on the basis of evidence he didn't have, and the official verdict was that he had been a little rude about it. But the vote itself was the thing. The numbers were the thing.
67 senators, 2/3 of the chamber, standing up and saying, "Enough. This stops here." McCarthy sat in his Senate seat and accepted the vote. He still had his title. He still had his desk. He was still technically the junior senator from Wisconsin and would remain so for the next 2.5 years. But within hours of the censure vote, the difference was palpable to everyone in Washington who worked near him. Colleagues who had previously walked over to greet him in the Senate corridors began taking different routes. Invitations to speak, to appear, to endorse, they dried up almost overnight. The phone calls from journalists looking for comment on the communist threat of the day slowed, then stopped. When McCarthy rose to speak on the Senate floor, senators found reasons to be elsewhere. The galleries were empty. President Eisenhower, who had spent years refusing to engage with McCarthy publicly, told Republican congressional leaders at a meeting the following summer that a new phrase was making the rounds in Washington. "It's not McCarthyism anymore," Eisenhower said. "It's McCarthyism." The era had a name. It was already in the past tense. What happened to Joe McCarthy in the 2.5 years between his censure and his death is, in its own way, as American a story as his rise. It is the story of a man who had built his entire identity on the performance of power, and who had absolutely no idea how to exist without an audience. He went to the Senate, he sat at his desk, he gave speeches that nobody covered. He introduced motions that went nowhere. He tried occasionally to revive some version of his old warnings about communist infiltration, and found that the press, which had once hung on his every word, now barely noted he had spoken. He had been what television made him, and television had moved on. He started drinking more heavily. The drinking had always been there, a background condition that people in Washington whispered about for years. But after the censure, the whispers got louder. Colleagues reported running into him in the Senate corridors in the afternoon and smelling the bourbon.
His skin had the yellowish, unhealthy cast that people who drink too much for too long eventually acquire. He was 46 years old and looked older. His wife, Jean, he had married Jean Kerr in 1953, a marriage that looked to some observers like another political calculation, an attempt to soften the bachelor image, watched what was happening and tried to help. They adopted a baby daughter and named her Tierney. McCarthy, by all accounts, was devoted to her. There were photographs of him from these years holding the little girl, and they show something that his Senate career photographs never quite showed: a human face, unguarded, actually happy.
Whatever he was in front of the cameras, there was apparently a man behind them who was capable of love. But the cameras were the thing. Without them, without the daily theater of accusation and counter-accusation, without the packed hearings and the shouted objections, and the sense that he was at the center of everything that mattered, without all of that, McCarthy didn't know what to do with himself. He had lived for years inside a kind of controlled chaos that he himself had generated. When the chaos stopped, there was nothing underneath it. No there, as people used to say. He was hospitalized in April of 1957. The official diagnosis was hepatitis, but everyone who knew him understood what was actually happening. The liver was failing. The body was breaking down under the accumulated weight of years of hard drinking and the particular grinding stress of a man watching his own importance evaporate while he was still alive to see it. He was admitted to Bethesda Naval Hospital in Maryland. On May 2, 1957, Joseph Raymond McCarthy died. He was 48 years old. The cause was given as acute hepatitis. The reality, understood by everyone who had watched him in his final years, was alcoholism and the destruction it does to the human body, combined with whatever it does to the spirit when everything you built turns out to be hollow. He was buried at St. Mary's Church in Appleton, Wisconsin. Thousands came to the funeral. Whatever history would say about him, Wisconsin was his state, and the people there remembered a senator, not a cautionary tale. President Eisenhower sent a message of condolence. Vice President Nixon attended the funeral service. In the Senate, there was a brief memorial. His colleagues stood and said the appropriate things, and then the Senate moved on, the way institutions move on, back to its ordinary business, which it had been unable to conduct normally for 4 straight years, while one man from a chicken farm in Grand Chute consumed all the available oxygen in Washington. Here is what the history books always get slightly wrong about the end of McCarthyism. They present it as a triumph, the demagogue defeated, decency restored, the system working as intended. And in one sense, yes, the man was stopped. The specific, branded McCarthyite form of the Red Scare died with his censure and his retreat into irrelevance. But let's be precise about what actually stopped him. It wasn't the Senate, which spent 4 years enabling him. It wasn't the Republican Party, which saw him as an electoral asset until he became too costly. It wasn't Eisenhower, who despised McCarthy privately and refused to confront him publicly for reasons that historians are still debating. It wasn't even Edward R. Murrow, whose broadcast was enormously important but came 4 years into the process after most of the damage was done. What stopped McCarthy was the camera. Not a journalist's camera, not a documentary filmmaker's camera, the Senate's camera. The cameras that were allowed into the Army-McCarthy hearings and broadcast 36 days of gavel-to-gavel proceedings into the living rooms of millions of American families who had never seen McCarthy in sustained, unedited action before. Newspapers could print his accusations, but they couldn't capture the way he treated people. Radio could carry his voice, but it couldn't show the smirk, the interruption, the way his eyes moved when a witness said something that threatened him. Television could.
and television did. The medium that had given McCarthy so much of his power in the early years, he was good on camera, charismatic, commanding, seemingly confident, ultimately destroyed him. Because it's very hard to maintain a performance for weeks on end, day after day, under unblinking cameras. The mask slips. The real thing shows through.
And what showed through, when America watched long enough and closely enough, was not the crusading patriot McCarthy had always presented himself as. What showed through was a bully. A man who interrupted, mocked, accused, pivoted, and bullied his way through every proceeding, and who, on the day that Joseph Welch refused to play along, had absolutely nothing left in reserve. The camera caught all of that, and the camera sent it into every living room in America simultaneously, in real time, without a newspaper editor to soften it or a publicist to spin it. This was new. In 1954, this was genuinely new. The political implications of live television, what it could do to a public figure, what it revealed, what it couldn't hide, were being worked out in real time. McCarthy was, in the most brutal way imaginable, the test case. He failed the test. And his failure established something that American politics has been working out the implications of ever since. The camera doesn't lie about certain things. It can be fooled about facts. It can be manipulated for short periods. But sustained exposure, day after day, hour after hour, in someone's living room rather than a newspaper column, eventually shows the thing underneath the performance. For McCarthy, what was underneath the performance was the cruelty that Welch named, the recklessness, the indifference to the damage he was doing to real people's real lives. But here is the thing that keeps the story of McCarthyism from being simple. Here is the thing that makes it uncomfortable and important and worth sitting with. The fear was real. Not McCarthy's manufactured crisis, not his shifting lists and invented numbers, but the underlying anxiety that made those lists credible to millions of Americans. That was real. The Soviet Union had an atomic bomb. Communist governments had taken power across Eastern Europe and China. The Korean War had killed American soldiers. Soviet intelligence had run operations on American soil. The Rosenbergs were not fiction. Alger Hiss was not fiction. The ideological battle between American democracy and Soviet communism was the defining struggle of the second half of the 20th century, and it was genuinely dangerous, and the outcome was genuinely uncertain. McCarthy's genius, if you can call it that, was his understanding that real fear doesn't require real evidence. Once a population is afraid enough, afraid in their bones, afraid in the way that parents are afraid when they think about the world their children will inherit, once that fear is in the air, you don't have to prove anything. You just have to point. The accusation becomes its own evidence because the fear is already there, looking for a target. McCarthy provided the targets. He did it efficiently, prolifically, and with complete indifference to the truth. But the fear he exploited was not his invention. This is why McCarthyism doesn't end with McCarthy. The mechanism, the use of accusation as a weapon, the construction of an enemy within, the framing of dissent as disloyalty, this mechanism exists independently of any single person. It is available. It is always available. It requires only a sufficient quantity of fear and a figure willing to pick it up. Dalton Trumbo, writing in the years after he was finally allowed to use his own name again on his screenplays, made a point that historians have wrestled with since. He said that in the years of the blacklist, there were no heroes and no villains, only victims. Because the people who named names, who turned on their colleagues and friends to save themselves, were also victims of a system that had made cowardice rational.
When the cost of telling the truth is your livelihood, your family's security, your children's future, who are we to judge the people who couldn't pay that price?
And who are we to overlook the fact that the system was specifically designed to make the price that high?
This is the hardest part of McCarthyism to look at. Not the senator himself, who is in some ways the easy part, the identifiable villain, the drunk at the center of the machine. The hard part is the people around him, the colleagues who knew he was lying and said nothing. The journalists who covered his accusations as legitimate news without demanding evidence. The studio executives who handed HUAC the names of their own employees to protect their box office. The friends who stopped calling the people on the lists. The neighbors who started crossing the street. The teachers who softened their syllabuses. The librarians who pulled the books themselves so nobody would come looking. Fear doesn't require guns to do its work. It just requires enough people making enough small, quiet decisions to go along with something they know is wrong.
Enough people deciding that the cost of speaking is too high. Enough people telling themselves it probably isn't as bad as it looks. And even if it is, somebody else will deal with it. McCarthyism, at its deepest level, wasn't about communism. It was a test of institutional resilience, of whether a democracy's mechanisms for protecting individual rights could withstand a sustained assault from someone who understood that the fastest way to destroy those mechanisms is to use them. McCarthy used Senate hearings to strip people of their livelihoods. He used the First Amendment, which protects speech, as cover for making speech dangerous. He used the democratic process to conduct what was, functionally, an anti-democratic inquisition. He turned the machinery of the Republic against the Republic's own people. And the machinery let him do it for 4 years. Edward R. Murrow closed his historic broadcast with Shakespeare. "The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves." It was an elegant way of saying what he could not say more directly on a corporate network in 1954. The problem is not McCarthy. McCarthy is a symptom. The problem is us. The problem is the willingness to be afraid, and the willingness to surrender judgment to the person who promises, loudly and confidently, to address that fear, regardless of what evidence they have, regardless of what methods they use, regardless of who gets crushed in the process. Murrow was 45 years old when he made that broadcast. He would die of lung cancer 11 years later, a man who had spent a lifetime with a cigarette in his hand, reporting from war zones and political crises and the long, slow emergency of a country testing itself. He had seen the London Blitz. He had seen McCarthy. In some ways, he said the same thing about both. This is real. This is happening. You need to know the truth of it. And what you do with that truth is on you. Murrow understood something about journalism, and about power, and about the specific vulnerability of democracies to the particular kind of politics McCarthy represented. He understood that the first casualty of a demagogue is not freedom of the press or freedom of speech. Those die later, after the soft targets are gone. The first casualty is the willingness to trust your own perception. The demagogue's core project is to make you uncertain about what you're seeing, to flood the zone with enough accusation and counter-accusation that you can't tell what's real, to make the truth feel like just one more opinion in a marketplace of opinions, no more reliable than anything else. McCarthy was brilliant at this, in his chaotic, improvised, tail gunner Joe way. The numbers changed. 205, 57, 81. And when you asked why, there was always an explanation, and the explanation produced another accusation. And suddenly, you were debating the explanation instead of the original lie. It was a technique that worked in an era of newspapers and radio, where the lag between lie and correction could be days or weeks. In an era of television,
It worked, until it ran into 6 uninterrupted weeks of live television. In our own era, the technique has been refined by people who understand the media environment far better than McCarthy ever did, who know that in a world where information moves at the speed of light, you can produce accusations faster than any fact-checker can keep up. This is why a story from 1950 feels, to anyone paying attention, like it was written last week. The word McCarthyism entered the American language as a noun, a verb, an adjective, a warning. To McCarthyize someone. McCarthyite tactics.
The McCarthyite impulse. Its first use in print was in a Washington Post editorial cartoon published in March of 1950, before McCarthy had even been operating for 2 months. The cartoonist Herbert Bloch, who signed his work Her Bloch, drew a stack of tar buckets with the word painted on top, and a reluctant elephant being pushed toward them. The implication was that McCarthyism was mess, contamination, something that stuck to everything it touched. That cartoon was published more than 70 years ago. The word is still in use. Not because McCarthy is still relevant as a historical figure in the way that, say, Lincoln or Roosevelt are relevant, but because the thing he represented keeps coming back. Not in the same form, not with the same cast of characters, not always with communism as the stated enemy, but the mechanism comes back. The accusation deployed as a weapon. The list that nobody can see, but that everyone is invited to fear. The loyalty test. The demand that you denounce your friends to prove your own innocence. The framing of disagreement as treason. These things come back because they are effective. McCarthy proved how effective they can be, how quickly an entire political culture can be reorganized around the fear of an invisible enemy, how thoroughly institutions can be paralyzed by the possibility of accusation, how completely power can be concentrated in the hands of the person willing to name names without producing evidence. He proved all of this. And the proof is available. The manual is written. The technique is there for anyone with the appetite to use it. What also exists, though, what the story of McCarthyism equally proves, is the fragility of that power once it's exposed. The thing that sustained McCarthy wasn't his strength. It was everyone else's silence. The moment enough people refused to be silent, Murrow with his broadcast, Welch in that hearing room, Flanders on the Senate floor, the millions of Americans whose letters and whose poll responses finally told the political class that the wind had changed. The whole structure came apart faster than anyone expected. 4 years of apparent omnipotence collapsed in a single summer. Because it was always a bluff. That's the thing about the piece of paper McCarthy waved in Wheeling. It's the thing about all the lists and all the hearings and all the accusations that never produced a single actual spy. It was theater. It was a performance of certainty by a man who had nothing. And performances, no matter how convincing, cannot survive indefinitely under the light of sustained, honest attention. Fred Fisher, the young lawyer Joseph Welch defended on June 9, 1954, went on to have the brilliant career that Welch predicted. He became a partner at Hale and Dorr. He raised a family in Massachusetts. He retired with his reputation intact. The moment that McCarthy used to try to destroy him, the moment Welch answered with the most famous question in Senate history, became not a stain on Fisher's record, but a footnote in an episode where he was the innocent party. History remembered McCarthy. It remembered Welch. And it remembered Fisher as the young man for whom someone decent finally, publicly, did the right thing. Dalton Trumbo, the blacklisted screenwriter who spent years writing under other people's names, eventually got his own name back. In 1960, the producer of Spartacus, a man named Kirk Douglas, publicly credited Trumbo by name for writing the screenplay. It was an act of deliberate defiance against the blacklist,
the first public crack in a wall that had stood for more than a decade. Trumbo went on to work openly until his death in 1976. He is remembered today as one of the finest screenwriters of his generation. Charlie Chaplin never came back. He lived out his life in Switzerland, returned to the United States only once, in 1972, to accept an honorary Academy Award, and died in his sleep on Christmas Day of 1977 at the age of 88. The country that had made him, that had laughed at him for half a century, had spent more than 20 years telling him he wasn't welcome. The honorary Oscar was, in some sense, the country finally apologizing, in the way that countries apologize, with an award, without the words. Roy Cohn left Washington after the Army-McCarthy hearings and went back to New York, where he spent the next 3 decades as a private lawyer with a client list that read like a guide to the darker corners of American power. Organized crime bosses, real estate developers, tabloid editors, a young businessman from Queens named Donald Trump, whom Cohn mentored in the late 1970s, and whom he taught, by all accounts, everything he knew about how to attack, how to never apologize, how to treat an accusation as a counterattack. Cohn died of AIDS in August of 1986.
He had spent years denying his diagnosis,
Denying his sexuality, continuing to represent clients while he was too sick to stand. He was disbarred in New York 5 weeks before his death on charges of unethical conduct. He died as he had lived, fighting, denying, refusing to admit that the walls were closing in. Edward R. Murrow spent several more years at CBS, continuing to make television that mattered, and then went to work for President Kennedy's administration as director of the United States Information Agency. He died of lung cancer on April 27, 1965, 2 days after his 57th birthday. Too young, too early. A mind that the cigarettes finally caught up with. His broadcast of March 9, 1954, is still taught in journalism schools. It is still cited as an example of what the press can do when it decides to actually do its job. Joseph Welch returned to Boston and his law practice. He became something of a celebrity in the years after the hearings, warmly received at restaurants, recognized on the street, asked to sign autographs by people who remembered watching him on television. He had one more brush with fame, playing the judge in the 1959 film Anatomy of a Murder. He died in October of 1960, at age 69. On his headstone, beneath his name and his dates, his family chose to put a phrase from his most famous words. The words he said when he finally looked at Joe McCarthy and said the thing that needed to be said. What do we do with McCarthyism now? What do we do with this 4-year disaster, this piece of American history that produced no actual spies, destroyed thousands of actual lives, and ended only when the machinery of television finally gave the country an unobstructed view of what one man's unchecked power actually looked like? One thing we don't do is pretend it was an aberration, a blip, a unique pathology of a unique moment. The Cold War tension, the nuclear anxiety, the particular personality of one senator from Wisconsin, that could never happen again, because we're smarter now, or more sophisticated, or more protected by our institutions. That comfort is exactly the kind of comfort that McCarthyism was designed to produce. The belief that it could only happen to other people, in other times, is precisely the condition under which it happens. What we might do instead is sit with the specific things that Murrow said in his closing monologue. Not the Shakespeare, beautiful as that was, but the lines that came just before it. He drew a distinction that the decades since have done nothing to disprove, between the fear that exists for real reasons and the operator who walks in and turns it into a weapon. That distinction, Who controls the fear, and to what end, and with what accountability, is the thing worth studying. The fear is not the enemy. Fear is human.
Fear is sometimes accurate.
The question is, who gets to decide what to do with it, and how, and by what rules, and with what evidence, and with what accountability when they get it wrong? McCarthy never got it wrong, publicly, on his own terms. He was never forced to account for the list that wasn't a list, or the numbers that changed every time he told the story, or the fact that in 4 years of Senate hearings, his investigations never produced a single successful prosecution for espionage. He was censured for being rude to his colleagues. He died before the full accounting arrived. In some ways, the accounting is still arriving.
Every time a government official accuses unnamed enemies of infiltrating unnamed institutions and asks you to trust them on the basis of evidence you can't see, every time a list circulates and the people on it have no recourse, no mechanism of defense, no way to face their accuser, every time the machinery of accusation is pointed at someone and everyone around them goes quiet and looks away, making the small individual calculation that this is not their fight, the accounting from 1950 is still arriving. The piece of paper that McCarthy held up in Wheeling, West Virginia on a winter night in 1950 was blank. It was nothing. And for 4 years, it was the most powerful document in America. Not because of what was written on it, because of what everyone around it was afraid to say. He didn't create the fear. He merely exploited it. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars. Good night, and good luck.